In recent years, the People's Republic of China has invested heavily in new capabilities like precision conventional missiles, counterspace weapons, and offensive cyber operations. These strategic weapons can create widespread catastrophic effects just short of nuclear. So why has Beijing pursued them? And more broadly, how do these weapons fit into the PRC's evolving theory of victory? I'd like to welcome Dr. Fiona Cunningham, author of the book Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons and International Security. Her book delves into these questions and introduces a new theory of strategic substitution. We'll discuss themes from her book, current trends across Chinese nuclear, conventional, and unconventional forces, and their implications for the future. Dr. Cunningham is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania and affiliated with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the Christopher H. Brown Center for International Politics at the university. She is also a research affiliate and an alumna, I'm proud to say, with the MIT Security Studies program. Her research has appeared in numerous academic and policy-oriented publications. She offers unique insights on China, including from her research engagements and time there. While we'll talk more in depth, one area of distinction in her scholarship is that it is informed by unique accesses and new Chinese language sources and interviews that offer a rare and candid view from Beijing on both its nuclear policy and decision-making and how it views the promise of information age technologies. I am Carrie Bingen, Director of the Aerospace Security Project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We will take audience questions, so please submit those via the event homepage, and they'll come to me where I can direct them to our guest. Welcome, Fiona. I think the first question I like to ask in one of these book talks is, why did you write a book?
Well, I'm going to start just by saying a huge thank you, Carrie, for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think that there are really two reasons why I wrote this book that I wanted to highlight at least today. The first is that when I was sitting on a long-haul flight from my native Australia back here to the United States, I was reading a PLA text and I noticed a very different way in which China was writing about the use of its nuclear weapons compared to its space and cyber capabilities in one chapter that was really about strategic domains. You had a very clear emphasis in the nuclear sections on retaliation and what we might think of as China's traditional no first use policy. But in the space sections, which I hadn't encountered before, I remember my jaw almost dropping when I saw things like using counter-space capabilities for things like punitive attacks and disciplinary action. So very, very different ways of thinking about these capabilities, yet there they all were in the same chapter. So I was really interested to dig in a little bit more to why we would see this variation in a set of capabilities that China deemed strategic. The second reason is that I have studied China's nuclear weapons program for an even longer time than I have been looking at the counterspace, cyber, and other information age weapons programs. And there had always been this puzzle. China professed that it had this no first use policy, it had a retaliatory sort of posture for using its nuclear weapons. And yet, as someone reminded me when they gave some feedback on my earlier research on these issues, that would mean that China would simply accept to lose a conventional war over a value or an objective that's as important to it as Taiwan. And so that created this other puzzle from which to try to understand, did China really want to do this, or had it come up with some other way that we were missing to solve this problem?
Well, and I think that really is then the crux of your book. And in your book, you introduce a new theory, a theory of strategic substitution, which I'll ask you to unpack for us. But perhaps you can add context to that by starting with, what is the problem that China was solving for at the time that led to the development of this class of strategic weapons?
So the book's sort of starting premise is this puzzle. And the puzzle is what I call the limited war dilemma. And it is a puzzle that all nuclear-armed states that face nuclear-armed competitors or adversaries have really had to struggle with since the dawn of the nuclear age. And that is, how could they still use their military capabilities to coerce their adversaries and achieve some of these political objectives when they had to now contend with the risk of a catastrophic nuclear war if they pushed too hard with those capabilities. I consider this to be a real dilemma. No country has come up with a kind of silver bullet that has allowed it to continue to coerce its adversaries without having to worry about this risk of nuclear escalation. But there are kind of two traditional ways of coping with this dilemma. One we might think of as the US's preferred version during the post-Cold War era, which is to field conventional capabilities that can impose a decisive victory on an adversary, and pairing that with nuclear weapons that would prevent an adversary from being able to kind of overturn that conventional victory by threatening nuclear use. The other kind of traditional option for dealing with the limited war dilemma is more similar to what we might expect from Pakistan or Russia, which is simply to rely on threats to escalate a conflict to the nuclear level to try and pressure an adversary to back down. The puzzle, though, for China is that it appeared to have done neither of these two things. And so the question then becomes, for a country that sees disadvantages in the nuclear option, because it does not see nuclear threats against a nuclear-armed adversary as being credible, and sees disadvantages in the conventional option because back in the early 1990s and mid-1990s, China really was significantly conventionally inferior to the United States. So imposing a victory using conventional forces on an adversary just didn't really seem to be feasible. So this created this problem that China had to come up with some other way to solve.
Well, and you introduce this theory of strategic substitution. So these new class of strategic weapons, short of nuclear, counterspace weapons, cyber weapons, and these precision conventional missiles that could have strategic effect, but again, short of nuclear. So can you explain this class in detail that forms the basis of your strategic substitution theory? What do they aim to achieve? Why focus on those three in particular as opposed to maybe other types of strategic weapons that they may have had at their disposal?
So I might just step back and explain a little bit what the logic of strategic substitution is too. I think the logic of strategic substitution is basically you use a threat of non-nuclear weapons that can have strategic effects on an adversary, and you pair that together with a retaliatory posture for your nuclear weapons. So using nuclear weapons only if you're attacked with nuclear weapons first. And what this combination is intended to do is to increase the risk of escalation, including potentially up to a nuclear war as well, but without actually having to threaten to use nuclear weapons. Rather, what strategic substitution is attempting to do is to use provocative non-nuclear attacks to push the burden of escalation, of crossing the threshold of using nuclear weapons in response on an adversary's sort of plate. And the appeal here, I think, really lies in that it's able to simultaneously address the credibility problem of threatening nuclear weapons used first that China diagnosed in the early 90s, and the feasibility problem of threatening conventional victory that China faced because of its conventional military backwardness. So strategic substitution provides a more credible and a quicker way of addressing this limited war dilemma than perhaps the two traditional alternatives. So information age weapons is the class of weapons that China preferred or decided to use to implement strategic substitution. It's my shorthand, as I think we've already said, for offensive cyber operations with strategic effects, precision conventional missiles that rely on information networks for things like battle damage assessment or acquiring targets, and of course, counterspace capabilities. And what each of these weapons promise to be able to do is to threaten escalation for a couple of sort of attributes that they might share. They have a promise of having strategic effects, although, as I'm sure we'll probably discuss a little bit later, that promise is questionable for some of these capabilities as they've evolved. But in any case, they can threaten to cause large-scale damaging effects on an adversary's military, its society, or its allies. They can cross salient or important thresholds in wars that are otherwise going to be bounded in their geographical scope and intensity. And they share technology with nuclear weapons that can enable states to kind of elevate the risk of nuclear conflict by simply choosing to use them. So that's kind of the set of attributes that I think makes these capabilities particularly promising for strategic substitution. The other things that China, or reasons I think why China picked these three, I think there are a couple of pieces here, and they're not the best substitutes that any country could pick. There is a sort of contingency, if you like, in why China chose these particular capabilities. One is the availability of technology. China has always had strengths in missile technology, in space technology, and at the time that it was dealing with the need to sort of address this limited war dilemma in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of kind of hype and excitement about cyber operations, computer virus weapons, as they were called at the time. And China was more broadly trying to digitize its economy, to informatize its military. And so there were broader sort of incentives for China to think about these capabilities. But if you look at some of the possibilities that China perhaps would have considered and discarded, things like conventional bombers, electronic warfare, which was very tightly yoked together with cyber operations in some early PLA writings, or even special operations forces that could conduct sabotage and other types of operations that have strategic effects. Some of the reasons why I think China eschewed these capabilities for coercive leverage, even though it has obviously developed these capabilities for sort of conducting ordinary conventional military operations, are availability of technology. China's aircraft technology has always been pretty backwards, and that made bombers sort of off the table in some ways for China to think about using them to deliver conventional munitions. Electronic warfare has this challenge of range, except perhaps in the counterspace domain, but also it's more easily defended against perhaps than some of the other capabilities, at least in the PLA mindset. And with something like special operations forces, I think one of the things that emerges from my book, and I talk about this right at the very end in the conclusion, is that China's top leaders want to assert as much control over weapons with strategic effects as they possibly can, and using special operations forces in ways that would enable them to have those kinds of strategic effects would perhaps have required China's leaders to delegate a lot more autonomy to these forces. And if you look at the couple of capabilities China has developed, they all allow it to kind of reach out from the Chinese mainland and have that intercontinental range, but without the actual operators necessarily getting too far from China's shores and outside of the watchful eye of the top leaders.
And I have several questions to unpack some of the details of everything that you've just laid out for us. One of them is you talk about these information age weapons as generating coercive leverage for Beijing. I wonder, is it really about coercive leverage, or are these meant to be warfighting capabilities? And I look at the last few years, we're seeing greater battlefield utilities, for example, of counterspace weapons, GPS jamming in Ukraine, in Israel. The annual Department of Defense China Military Power Report talks about how China may seek to target our space capabilities or our command and control capabilities in advance of say, a U.S. force interceding in a Taiwan Strait scenario. So is it meant to be coercive, or is it meant to be an actual warfighting capability?
So I grappled a lot with these kinds of questions as I was writing the book, because again, one of the attractions perhaps of these information age weapons rather than other weapons of mass destruction like chemical or biological weapons is obviously they have warfighting applications as well, and many of them are actually kind of core to how we might think of the nature of high-end conflict, conventional conflict today. So one of the appeals is that as you develop them for coercion, you will also be developing other capabilities that are going to have warfighting applications. But there are a couple of ways that I sort of try to draw this distinction between warfighting and coercive applications within the book. One of them is to think even within each class of weapons, so let's say counterspace weapons or offensive cyber operations, there were going to be types of these weapons whose effects are simply too localized or too temporary to really reach the desk of the president or the Central Military Commission vice chairman within China and have an effect upon how those leaders are thinking about prosecuting a conflict. There are some that are not going to have any, and so for example, with those more sort of battlefield applications, you might think of the kind of GPS jamming piece that you just described. On the other hand, if you engage in an offensive cyber operation against a sanitation facility here in the continental United States, someone who is in the midst of a battle for, the outlying islands of Taiwan or something like that, are probably not going to feel the effects of that, but someone in the White House is probably going to be worrying about it, right? And then you have these capabilities in between, like a kinetic attack on a US ISR satellite in low Earth orbit, which is probably going to affect both the warfighter on the ground as well as the decision maker within the White House. So strategic substitution probably does not have a lot to say about the battlefield effects that are not going to reach the desk of someone in the White House, unless those capabilities are used as the kind of lower end on an escalation ladder that's meant to make the use of that kinetic ASAT more likely. It's instead sort of, I guess, dealing with these weapons that can have strategic effects. So that's one way to sort of deal with the distinction, is to look at what capabilities are going to be the emphasis. The second is that I focus quite a lot in the book on this idea of coercive force postures, where I'm really looking at different components of how a state organizes or arrays its military forces in cyberspace or for its counterspace capabilities, to see how it's going to manage the tensions that are sometimes formed when there are certain requirements for, let's say, counterspace capability to be used to support warfighting and for coercive effect. And I think this comes up perhaps most clearly where you look at the organizational practices. If you want to use the capability for warfighting, perhaps you're going to need to delegate the ability to use that capability down to a theater commander who's trying to coordinate the effects of using a counterspace capability with what his, her, or their general purpose conventional forces, the air forces, the naval forces are doing. But if you want to use them for coercive effects, maybe you don't want the theater commander in control of them. You want the top leader so that they know exactly when they can use those capabilities to have an effect on an adversary. So I sort of look at how those tensions are managed within China, and if a country tends to prioritize using a capability for or organizing a capability in ways that are optimized for coercion, that might take precedence over the warfighting options.
Well, and I want to pick up on one of the examples that you just gave, which is offensive cyber operations. They could target U.S. sanitation facilities in messaging Washington, not just a localized theater. And I think that's really interesting. Part of your book is it's not just looking at theater warfare or the other end of the spectrum, which is a strategic nuclear exchange affecting the homeland. They have built out this whole class of these new, as you call them, information age weapons that include targeting the U.S. homeland, which I would think would be highly escalatory. So how are they thinking about this, where it's okay now to take to beyond nuclear or short of nuclear, to have a class of weapons that target the U.S. homeland, whether it be critical infrastructure, GPS, other pieces?
So of the capabilities that China has developed thus far, the only one that has, matured in a way that can attack the US homeland would be the cyber operations. There have been reports, I think, of China developing a conventional intercontinental range conventional strike capability. But thus far, we haven't seen something like that deployed, and there'd obviously be particular escalation risks involved with that. So there's one capability that China has developed thus far that can touch the US homeland. I think you have to step back a little bit and think of this from China's perspective in the conflicts they're anticipating in the Taiwan Strait, which is the kind of key motivating conflict contingency for which these kinds of capabilities are developed. They're probably expecting that fairly early on in that conflict, the United States is going to be attacking at least some things on the PRC mainland, even if they're along the coast, because the US is playing an away game, China's playing a home game. And that has some advantages and some disadvantages for China. But one of the disadvantages is that its homeland is vulnerable to doing so. So they might see the US as kind of crossing that homeland threshold first. But in addition to that, if we look at offensive cyber operations in particular, I think a lot of scholars have suggested that maybe using these capabilities, they're not quite as good tools of escalation as we might have thought when we were talking about things like cyber Pearl Harbor some years ago, because their effects are ephemeral, they're difficult to coordinate, because they're non-kinetic, it just doesn't have quite the same salience. At the same time, though, if you look at how US officials talked about the Volt Typhoon intrusions, which have been understood to be pre-positioning malware in US critical infrastructure with the intent of shaping US decision-making and responsiveness to any contingency in the Indo-Pacific involving Taiwan, then perhaps we might be more worried about these capabilities than some of that scholarship suggests. So there's also quite a bit, I think, of uncertainty about how severe the effects would be and how the United States might end up responding. So that uncertainty, I think, in some ways helps China to think about the escalation risks as being a sort of range, and that uncertainty, I think, assists them to think about the deterrent value of these capabilities.
Well, I wanted to tease you out a bit further on that, as how China is thinking about the risk of escalation and how they might manage it, because you talk about these two different types of I'll say, escalation risk management in your book, and you also draw on Thomas Schelling, which was great to see that quote, that the objective of such weapons and approach is to leave something to chance. So how much are they really willing to leave to chance as they think about escalating with these weapons?
So there are layers to this, and I'll start a little bit with the capabilities themselves, the information age weapons themselves, which is that in the book I lay out two ways that countries might think about using these capabilities coercively. One is a brinkmanship capability that is designed to really emphasize the autonomous or uncontrolled risks of escalation from using a capability, where you're pretty opaque about how you command them, about how you would plan to use them, but you demonstrate that you have capabilities. The other option is to have a calibrated escalation posture, which it thinks much more about escalation like ascending the rungs of a ladder, where you're trying to signal very clearly where your red lines are, what's coming next, and that you have very tight control over those capabilities. And what's interesting is that all of China's capabilities for its information age weapons have evolved over time from a brinkmanship posture to a calibrated escalation posture, with one exception. It always thought about using its counterspace capabilities in that kind of controlled, calibrated escalation manner. So it was always talking about limited hostilities in space if it was going to use these capabilities. So that's sort of the first layer, is that you have options for how you might actually use these capabilities that can depend upon things like what technologies you have available, as well as your preferences for how much autonomy you're willing to give to your commanders and things like that, that might make you more comfortable with brinkmanship. But the other thing that I think is important to bring out from strategic substitution is that it tells us something about, more broadly, how China wants to approach problems of escalation in any of the wars that it's preparing for going forward. And that is, there is a desire, I think, from China's leaders that trickles down to the PLA to really control and manage the way that escalation is going to occur, because China is really trying to contain any sort of escalatory behavior below the nuclear threshold by using these information age weapons. They now want to control the way that each of these information age weapons can be used with these calibrated escalation postures. And they don't want to end up going into the nuclear domain, where I think quite a bit of research now suggests that China is not that confident that once a nuclear war begins, that you can fight and win a limited nuclear conflict and terminate that. So there's a sort of emphasis, if you like, on control, and that control, I think, shows up in how China thinks about how Chinese leaders think about delegating authority to their military operators to engage in certain types of operations. What's missing there, in my opinion, is an understanding of how China is going to account for the vote that the adversary gets. Because you can't control how the US is going to react. And as I've already mentioned, there are some serious uncertainties about the effects and the reactions these kinds of information age weapons will entail. They're quite novel. And so as a result of that, there is this sort of uncertainty about whether China will actually succeed in controlling escalation to the degree that it appears to have set out to in architecting this strategic substitution approach.
Well, and you talked a bit about space, so I want to touch on that now. And then I also want to touch on nuclear and entanglement, which you also discuss in your book at great length. So counterspace, the book puts the PRC's pursuit of counterspace capabilities in context alongside other capabilities for strategic deterrence. So can you talk a bit about your research on China's pursuit of counterspace weapons, including new scholarship that you've done on our understanding of China's motivation? You hit on this a bit here. But also when you look at today, all the different things that China is doing on the counterspace front, direct descent anti-satellites. We've had U.S. generals talk publicly about seeing Chinese satellites dogfighting in space, these rendezvous and maneuver operations, fractional orbital bombardment systems, FOBs. I guess, does your theory explain what I would characterize as quite aggressive actions by China in the space domain?
So my intent is, yes, that it's going to capture those. I really enjoyed writing the counterspace chapter, and I thought it was particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. So I'll explain a couple of the interesting findings and special features, if you like, of that chapter. One of the first things is that I went into researching China's counterspace operations and pursuit of those capabilities, thinking that I was really going to see recognition of the potential for counterspace capabilities to emerge out of the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s. But instead, what I found is that China became very aware of the role of space support capabilities in fighting in what they used to call high technology operations. Now they speak about sort of informatized operations. But this was about how you use your conventional military forces to make use of information technology, and space played a role therein. It wasn't really until the late 1990s and early 2000s that China starts to demonstrate an awareness of the potential of counterspace capabilities. So in particular, I argue in the chapter that China's key decisions about pursuing a counterspace weapons posture comes after it suffers what I call a leverage deficit, this realization because of a crisis that they simply lacked adequate military capabilities to fight the kind of war that they needed to fight. They needed to do something about it. One of the things they did was pursue offensive cyber operations. The other was to pursue counterspace capabilities for coercive leverage. If you look through the book, you'll also see, and for those of your listeners who followed these issues keenly, that China's kinetic kill vehicle for its anti-ship ballistic missile, very similar to its kinetic kill vehicle for its direct descent anti-satellite weapon. And China begins to pursue that KKV in about 1997. But the feasibility study that I was able to look at suggests that this is primarily for the anti-ship mission rather than the anti-satellite mission. So it takes a little while, I think, for China to kind of get around to the realization of that there's a real potential for coercive leverage from its counterspace capabilities. The second thing that I point out from the counterspace chapter is the substitution logic is the most crystal clear in this chapter. So you see a lot of writings from Chinese PLA strategists sort of saying counterspace operations are much more flexible. They do not directly cause loss of life. They directly target military objectives rather than civilians. And so for all of these reasons, it's a superior form of deterrence to nuclear deterrence. The third thing that I point out comes towards the end of the chapter, which is, interestingly enough, this is the one capability where you really do start to see China worry, again, in the last, I'd say, 5 to 6 years, about inadvertent nuclear escalation risks from conducting counterspace operations. You just do not see that nearly as clearly in the offensive cyber and precision conventional strike chapters, but you start to see China worrying a little bit more about that. Speaking more to the capabilities that China has been developing, they fit within my theory and my explanation because in order to carry out a calibrated escalation force posture, China needs a broad array of counterspace capabilities, including those that are kinetic, that are non-kinetic, that are on orbit, that are direct descent, as well as all of the tracking and support capabilities on the ground that will enable them to target those counterspace capabilities effectively. So the dogfighting, the on-orbit capabilities, the grappling arms, the towing, all of those sorts of pieces I see as sort of demonstrating capability, although whether they're deployed counterspace capabilities, I think, is another question. We did see intelligence reporting, I think, from around 2019 through 2020 period, suggesting that China had deployed its direct descent anti-satellite weapons at this point in time. With the FOBs, I see it a little bit differently as perhaps being more about assisting China to continue delivering nuclear weapons effectively if the United States is going to deploy more comprehensive missile defenses, which may well be on the horizon, because that kind of a capability creates both distinction and tracking problems for an adversary. So I'll leave it there, but there's plenty more we can talk about on the counterspace pieces.
Well, and you also write too in your counterspace section about how China is closely observing what the United States and others are doing in the proliferated architectures in leveraging commercial capabilities more, and they're now thinking through how do we stay on top of that and counter those evolving capabilities. You also hit on the entanglement issue, so I want to tackle that. I think about the mutual understanding between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, where it was generally understood that if you attack our nuclear command and control satellites, our NC-3 satellites, our missile warning satellites, that crosses a red line and risks nuclear response. I just don't have a good sense for if Beijing has that same understanding. And you write this so eloquently. I mean, when you think about the counterspace capabilities are building, some of these cyberspace capabilities are building, there is an entanglement aspect to this. So in your research, what did you uncover on this entanglement issue and just how they think about that and the risks of escalation that they present?
So in the theoretical setup of the book, I rely quite a lot on the academic literature, both of sort of late Cold War era as well as more recently, pointing to these inadvertent escalation risks and entanglement risks, because conventional missiles can deliver, or the same sort of missile can deliver a nuclear warhead. Both satellites as well as sort of computer information networks both support nuclear operations. So if you develop the capabilities to attack satellites, to attack information networks, what's to say that you're not going to use them against satellites or information networks that also support nuclear operations? So there are kind of counterforce applications to a lot of these information age weapons, and indeed I think that's one of the areas that the United States has actually really thought about using these capabilities. And then there are also these misperceptions that can come from thinking an adversary might be using them in a kind of counterforce capacity. So that's where the theoretical ideas, if you like, of the entanglement and its promise for generating escalatory risk comes from. When it came to actually looking, though, at how China thought about the promise of these capabilities, they were much more focused on the effects and the crossing of thresholds, and rarely did they actually pick up on these entanglement potential of these weapons as a source of leverage and as a reason why an adversary might find them very provocative and be deterred with them. I think that China's scholars themselves actually started to write about questions of inadvertent nuclear escalation, I'd say starting in about the early 2000s. If you look at, I think, some recently published scholarship by Wu Riqiang at Tsinghua University, he's, I think, one of the leading scholars. But in general, China and Chinese experts, I think, are much more relaxed about these inadvertent escalation risks than the United States, even when they become quite aware of what the kind of theoretical pathways happen to be. But I think the most interesting one in some ways for me is the inadvertent escalation risks that come from counterspace capabilities, because as I said, I noticed this in sort of 2019 articles published by some PLA researchers, this concern that there's a connection to strategic nuclear systems in space that means it's a sort of sensitive domain to engage in hostilities. And that was the sort of only chapter where I really started to see these concerns about inadvertent escalation come out. And it's worth noting that for most of the period that I'm writing in this book, China actually didn't have early warning satellites supporting its nuclear operations. This has been a relatively recent development that China has started to launch some of these capabilities in the last 6 years or so. It tested what many believe to be a high-altitude direct-descent anti-satellite capability in 2013. And if you look back at the Department of Defense's China Military Power Report last year, they still appear to be expecting China to be interested in that capability, even though now itself is also putting up early warning satellites in geosynchronous orbit. So that kind of reciprocity, if you like, in thinking between the US and the Soviets is not or has not been there for China and the US in the last, I think, 3 decades. And I think it remains to be seen whether China actually thinks about the sort of mutual restraint impact of having its own satellites in geosynchronous orbit that are supporting its nuclear operations. Are they going to see that in the same way as the US and the Soviets did? And I think that's an open question.
That's a really great point. And as you said, just an open question for scholarship and discussions going forward. So let me ask one more question, and then I'll shift to some excellent audience questions coming in, and would encourage our audience to continue submitting questions. Back to just the fundamental premise of your book is you articulate that the problem is in Beijing is that they had a leverage deficit to prepare for a localized or limited war, i.e., across the Taiwan Straits. As they were searching for solutions at the time, they had inadequate conventional capabilities and resource or otherwise didn't have the budget to really amp those up in the near term. They also didn't believe that they could build out at that time a credible nuclear force. So that's really the impetus for this approach where they developed these strategic information age weapons. Fast forward to today, I guess the question is, those two factors are being mitigated by China. They have throttled forward on their conventional military forces. I mean, we're actually concerned. We have great scholarship at CSIS from folks like Seth Jones that have written China's industrial base is on a wartime footing, ours is not. You look at the missile imbalance, the ship imbalance, those numbers are in their favor. On the nuclear side as well, they have also put pedal to the metal on nuclear modernization across their triad. So do they, I guess the fundamental question is then, do they still have a leverage deficit with conventional and nuclear accelerating? And if not, why would they still then pursue this strategic class of non-nuclear weapons?
So it's an excellent question, and it reminds me that I should be very clear about what the substitution claim is in the book, because it's absolutely incontrovertible that in the same period that China has built out this strategic substitution set of capabilities, they have certainly not let their conventional capabilities or their nuclear capabilities stand still. And on the contrary, the nuclear capabilities, I think, have really dramatically accelerated their modernization in the last 6 to 7 years. So the substitution claim is not to say that by picking information age weapons as the kind of core of your theory of victory, that you are not going to, you're going to ignore or are precluded from building up your conventional and nuclear capabilities, but rather it is to argue that there's a slightly different logic that's driving the conventional and the nuclear buildup. Some scholarship, I think, has demonstrated that a lot of China's conventional military modernization and its strategy is very much sort of driven by understanding how other great powers in the system are fighting wars. And so they're very attentive to watching how all of the leading military powers are engaging in conflict and adjusting their conventional military strategy accordingly. Similarly, the nuclear force is very responsive to what they see as the challenges of survivability compared to another adversary's sort of pursuit of counterspace capability. So there's no bar on modernizing because you're building up these capabilities, but rather what the argument is that if you experience these leverage deficits, a crisis with an adversary, you need something that is going to give you some coercive leverage in case your adversary does engage in another or initiates another crisis before your modernization campaign is complete, if you are planning to do a conventional military modernization campaign. So it doesn't preclude the fact that in the future you may have other options to go with the conventional or the nuclear answers to the limited war dilemma if you so choose. And China has obviously modernized dramatically in both of those two areas. I think an interesting way to think about whether China will experience leverage deficits going forward is to look at the Pelosi visit to Taiwan back in 2022. Mm-hmm. I talk about it a bit in the book too. It's a bit too early to tell, and we don't have the sources to see, but during that one might call it Taiwan Straits crisis that looks, in some ways a little bit similar to the one in 1995-96. Mm-hmm. China engaged in a pretty significant show of military force. They again displayed their now much more advanced conventional military capabilities, as well as some of their naval information and other types of capabilities. And so it remains to be seen whether that show of force has actually satisfied China in thinking, well, actually, maybe we did pretty well and maybe we don't need another information age weapon to bolster our coercive leverage going forward. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about the future of China's strategic deterrence and whether it will continue with this approach that it has built up is how confident is China that this is actually going to work? Because strategic substitution is a gamble. No other nuclear-armed country has done this before. This is not tried and tested. And so China now has 3 decades of looking at how these capabilities have performed. The US hasn't stood still. It has tried its best to counter some of them. And so if China's leaders lose confidence in the leverage they can get from these capabilities, then they might shift away from strategic substitution, whether seeing it as a stopgap and now conventional military modernization is enough, or what concerns me a lot more, which is looking more at the nuclear option and saying, well, maybe we, even if nuclear is not that credible and it's not the best option we might have, we are not convinced that information age weapons are going to work. And so this is the least bad option that we currently have.
Well, and you set me up perfectly for this question from Henry Sokolsky at the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center. Hello, Henry. We are great admirers of the work that you do at MPIC. Does Russia have its own version of China's strategic substitution, or is it taking an entirely different approach? And let me pair that with a question from some of our next-gen scholars here at CSIS. So fortunate to have Chase Harward and Ishani Petty here on the team, who ask, were there subtle aspects of China's strategic culture or historical context that you believe are most crucial in predisposing Beijing to this pathway that maybe makes it less likely to be replicated by other states? So 2 different aspects of the question there.
So thank you all for the questions. I'll start with the Russia one by just noting that while strategic substitution is a distinctive choice that China has made in the post-Cold War era, the 2 key drivers of this choice, which is concern about the credibility of making nuclear threats and intense concern if you are conventionally inferior about being subjugated by your adversaries who are conventionally superior and needing something to offset that. These are pervasive concerns of nuclear-armed and, in fact, also non-nuclear-armed states today in thinking, how do you deal with these 2 problems? And while I am not a Russia expert and by no means have the same degree of knowledge and understanding of Russian thinking on these problems, from what I understand from scholars like Kristen Van Brusgaard, Michael Kaufman, Anya Fink, who I think work very deeply on these issues, is that Russia was debating whether or not it would lower its threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in the early 2000s, and then invested quite significantly in what it called non-nuclear strategic deterrence, so especially the precision conventional strike, and then started to reconstitute, I think, some of its counterspace capabilities probably about 2 decades or a decade and a half ago. So I think what Russia has done perhaps is to use these information age weapons to give it more rungs on the escalation ladder at lower levels, but without abandoning a first use nuclear strategy. So we can think of these information age weapons used coercively more like complements rather than substitutes for Russia's nuclear heavy theory of victory. That's sort of how I would make sense of it. And on the what's distinctive about China piece, I would have to dive a lot more deeply into the kind of cross-national comparisons to answer the Next Gen Fellows, I think, very important question. But a couple of things that jumped out to me when I finished writing this book about China were, first of all, I think that there's a real unevenness to China's technological development. And so that's one of the reasons why I think China ended up down this pathway, is because of investments that probably go all the way back to the early Cold War, where China really prioritized its missile capabilities and neglected things like, for example, its aircraft. A second thing is the beliefs that China's leaders have had about the utility of nuclear weapons. That is certainly an important factor that led them to invest in other capabilities and to have these strong credibility concerns that perhaps were more extensive than other nuclear-armed countries. And then the third, I think, distinctive aspect of China is the party-army relations. The top civilian leaders in the party are reluctant to delegate too much autonomy to the military in order to use strategic weapons. And that really, I think, does inform certainly how they implement these capabilities. And if you had another country with exactly the same circumstances of China, but absent those party-army relations, their version of strategic substitution might actually look quite different.
So you mentioned China's longstanding nuclear no first use policy. I have to say, though, when I look at the extensive expansion and modernization of their nuclear forces, they appear to be designing a nuclear force that may no longer be fit for a no first use policy. Did your research uncover any trends or insights on that topic?
Certainly. So I would say a couple of things about the no first use policy. The first is that I think you are absolutely spot on that maybe even 10 years ago, we would be able to look at China's nuclear forces and there were like 300 warheads. They're kept at a very low state of readiness, very high degree of party control over the military. You could make an argument by that China's words and deeds might have matched in terms of its no first use policy, that force posture wasn't capable of doing a whole lot more than retaliating for a nuclear strike or in extremis if China faced some other type of threat to its survival. No longer, I think, are China's nuclear forces constraining of the way that it's going to use its capabilities. Although I would still expect to see some other smoking guns if China was going down the route of Pakistan or Russia in terms of how it wanted to use its nuclear weapons. So I wouldn't expect them to be promoting a no first use policy to the same degree that they are diplomatically. I'd expect to perhaps see more of China's short-range ballistic missiles that had nuclear capabilities to, again, lower the threshold of nuclear weapons use to make it more credible. And I might also expect to see a little bit more change in terms of the readiness of the force. So there are a couple of things that I would expect to see, I think, if China was abandoning strategic substitution and going down the road of nuclear first use. But I think the other couple of things that I learned about China's no first use policy is that, first of all, this is not a foregone conclusion. The second chapter of my book demonstrates quite clearly that periodically China's strategists and even their leaders have debated whether China should continue this policy, whether they should continue an assured retaliation strategy. And so they have chosen this because they've seen better alternatives over time. The third thing I will just say is that some of my more recent research has also suggested that China's nuclear modernization resulted from a domestic consensus, because for once these debates sort of resulted with consensus that we should change something about our nuclear forces and operations, but different sections sections of China's strategic community is supporting the modernization for different reasons. Some support it because they want to bolster China's retaliatory capabilities. They think it's been losing retaliatory capability with US counterforce capabilities developments. Strategic competition means that you need a higher threshold of damage too. Others supported it because they because they think that having a larger and more sophisticated nuclear arsenal will give them political leverage over the US in a Taiwan contingency. And this is not like, let me do better in a nuclear war or a conventional war with force posture changes, but a sort of more is better, and that this is going to have a psychological effect on US decision makers. The missile forces appear to be interested in how to use nuclear weapons to influence conventional conflicts, but they're not advocating openly for changes to the no first use policy. And there are some questions about why the top leader might have supported the modernization that may have to do with kind of historical lessons coming from the Soviet Union, that you need a strong strategic deterrent, but you also don't want to end up in an arms race that strains your ability to function normally as an economy. So that's sort of what my research has suggested about the reasons for the modernization.
So let me shift to another foreign country, Iran, and lessons and observations that Beijing may be taking from Iran's nuclear program or the erosion of it. So this question comes from Braden Holt at the Stimson Center. Do you think the recent U.S. strikes in Iran will increase Beijing's perception of a leverage deficit with Washington? And how do you think this does or doesn't change China's thinking about strategic competition with the United States?
So I think it's an important question. It's a tricky question. I think it's also just worth noting that China is watching the Ukraine war very, very carefully for some lessons on these issues too. I would say a couple of things to start with. I don't think that China would look at the US and Israeli strikes on Iran as posing a leverage deficit, because generally speaking, the leverage deficits tend to, or the ones that I observe in my book, have tended to involve the United States and China directly. So the Taiwan Strait crisis, which was in many ways triggered by US support for Taiwanese leaders, or that Beijing perceived as supporting Taiwanese independence and sort of crossing a line there. The Belgrade embassy bombing, I looked a little bit at the EP3 collision as well, and actually that one didn't form a leverage deficit because China's leaders, drew quite different lessons about US intentions from that conflict. But what I think the PRC would be looking at, that set of capabilities and the Iran-Israeli strike, might be to understand a little bit more about the US's capabilities to destroy the sort of deeply buried targets. China uses a decent number of underground facilities for some of its nuclear capabilities as well. They might also be thinking about the missile defense capabilities, and the way in which Iran's air defenses had been picked apart, facilitating the strike in the first place. And one of the things China did become very concerned about after the Belgrade embassy bombing was the uncontested, or the ease with which the US would have been able to enter its airspace. So again, that's likely to, I think, drive some lessons about defending one's own airspace as well. But I would think of those lessons as being a little bit more in the kind of operational pieces, rather than exposing a leverage deficit that's going to lead China to deep introspection about what they can do to fill the gap.
Mm-hmm. So as we're winding down here, let me just put two more questions on the table for you. The first one is, you, in the course of your research and scholarship, you've gained just some tremendous, I'll say, access and insights about how Beijing thinks. Your book has original Chinese language sources and interviews that offer a rare and candid view from Beijing of both the dilemmas posed by its nuclear challenges, as well as the promise of information age technologies. So, maybe taking a step back, and I know you've touched on this throughout the course of this conversation this afternoon, but can you share maybe some new insights on Chinese thinking and your observations overall? What did you learn, including on some of their internal debates and decision-making regarding their nuclear forces, its military, and how they're thinking about future crises and conflicts?
So I'll add a couple of things. some favorite pieces from the research as well that maybe are not quite so recent, but I think tell us some interesting bits and pieces. One of the most interesting anecdotes, if you like, from this book, I think, comes from the conventional missile chapter, where we see right in the late 1980s as China's leaders shifting from thinking about general wars in which they'll face threats to their survival of Soviet invasion to these local wars. And they're not totally clear yet that it's going to be a Taiwan contingency that's the kind of key focus here. And at this point in time, China's defense industry has been instructed to go and finance itself. They are looking at expanding foreign military sales, and there's a set of conventional missile sales that are blocked to the Middle East in part because of US pressure. And China's rocket forces are questioned by the leadership. What are you going to do in a local war if you're a nuclear-only force? And they seize on these conventional missiles in part because of the organizational survival incentives. So they see a conventional mission as being a way to make sure that they still stay relevant in a future conflict. And that eventually grows into the capabilities China tests during the 95-96 Taiwan Straits crisis and the huge headache that we know of today is China's conventional missile force in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that tells you something quite interesting about the organizational incentives of different PLA services, and that's something we should also keep an eye on when we're trying to analyze what's going on within China, that you do see these examples of military services behaving in ways that might look quite familiar from how we think about the US, the British, or other militaries looking at their future. A second thing that I think I would draw out from this is just the importance of top leadership control. I think one of the takeaways from the book is very much the importance of party leadership control over the military just as much as there is about a focus on conventional conflict. And so as we look forward to how China is preparing for future conflicts, being aware of the desire for control from the top leaders, I think we sort of see it a little bit with analysis of the anti-corruption campaigns, but I think that that's also quite important. The third thing I would point out is that I learned a lot from talking to Chinese experts through various years of interviews as recently as earlier this year. Obviously, they didn't make it into the book because the book was published in January. But those conversations can be very valuable just for things like understanding how we might assume an escalation ladder looks and how China might take quite a different perspective on that. But I would point out, since we're at the Aerospace project here, that one of the areas where China does not have as much of a community is in national security space. And so that is a slightly trickier area than, for example, nuclear or cybersecurity, to sort of get a sense of what's going on within China. So they would be a couple of the sort of insights that I would draw out from the access that I've had, but that I think hopefully the book demonstrates the value of being able to do this kind of work and continue that kind of access to China for really understanding what's going on with the PLA and what's going on with China's military modernization.
Well, and that's a really interesting observation on their, I'll say, lack of national security space policy expertise, and maybe one of the explanations for why track 1s and track 2s have been so challenging to have with Beijing. So let me end on an opportunity to give you any last words, but also, through the course of your research, the engagement, the direct access and insights that you've gained and you've had, so are you more optimistic or pessimistic about where China is heading? And then, any prospects for, building transparency and more candid dialogues? Arms control consistently rears its head. Your optimism and your pessimism on the relationship.
So these are tricky questions.
Yeah.
I think the first thing that I will just say is coming back from this book, I think one of my main conclusions from a policy perspective is that managing the US-China strategic relationship can't just be a nuclear peace, that you are going to need to build in somehow all of these non-nuclear capabilities that have strategic effects if you're going to be able to have, I think, a conversation that puts everything on the table that the US and China are going to be concerned about. And I would add on there missile defense, because that's one of China's major concerns in terms of US capabilities, also an area where China is improving its capabilities.
They have their own
too.
capabilities too.
So having a conversation that includes all of those pieces, and that's going to be very difficult because, as our conversation about warfighting and coercion suggests, drawing a line of what is a capability that just doesn't belong at a table where you're discussing strategic deterrence is quite a challenging thing to do, when it might sit in quite different places. Not least to mention how you get all of these communities that don't have a lot of experience talking with the enemy or the adversary are going to put together an agenda and come to the table and even get on the same page on their own sort of side. So I think that's a very complex task, but at the very least, I think that gives us some insight as to how we might need to frame the problem going forward if there is going to be any cooperative management of the US-China relationship. I think two other things I would say that are cause for pessimism as well as optimism. In terms of pessimism, I'm quite concerned about a US-China nuclear arms race, because I think that China's lack of explanation of why it has been building up its nuclear forces has led to a set of assumptions within Washington about how the US government needs to respond. And the US, I think, is going to move towards those responses at this point in time, and then China is going to have to counter that. And so I think we're in a tricky place from the nuclear relationship. The cause for optimism, though, is, as I said previously, some of the areas where China could have adopted a first-use nuclear policy. I think we don't see movement in some of those directions yet. So there's room to perhaps prevent that from occurring, or China's own choices not to do so. But at the same time, I think strategic substitution might be a least bad solution from the US's perspective, because China's going to want some form of leverage. And of those three theories of victory, first use, conventional decisive victories, or strategic substitution is the one that I think countries can have the least amount of confidence that it's going to work compared to the other tried and tested options, even if they come with costs and risks. So I'm a little bit more optimistic that uncertainty might deter either of the two countries from thinking that engaging in a conflict is something they can be confident that they can prevail in.
That's really well said, and those are areas, whether it be cyber or space, that you've seen our government and Department of Defense increase its attention, organization, investment in Space Force, Space Command, Cyber Command, et cetera. Dr. Fiona Cunningham, I want to thank you so much. This was a fantastic discussion this afternoon. I would like to commend to our audience her book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons and International Security. Thank you for the scholarship that you provide. I mean, this, I think, for whether you're a policymaker, professional, student, or public that's interested in understanding China's thinking, you are increasing our understanding with some pretty tremendous research, access, and insights, and a dose of realism, too, which is important to inform policymaking. So thank you very much for the book and for the insights you shared today. I want to thank Chase Howard, supporting the Aerospace security team, and our streaming and broadcasting team.